This is video journal for week 4, EDUU 676, reflection on evidence-based practices. I'll begin by talking about the IRIS modules. And I think what struck me initially was the developmental variation that I saw between a 4-year-old, 11 and 13-year-old, and then a 17-year-old. I'm not certain if that variation is the product of intervention or level of intervention, or age related. I'm not sure, but I think the one that probably caught my attention the most was Dylan, who's a 13-year-old. And as I watched, I was like, I was having a hard time grasping how this kid was diagnosed with autism, because I did not see some of those hallmark traits, the lack of social communication, lack of eye contact, certain things that you would naturally associate with autism spectrum disorders. I mean, very intelligent. So that I think is the one thing initially that struck me the most. But then looking at Tyler and his mother's discussion of her initial thoughts on ABA and some of the maybe trepidation she had about the procedures or methods, and then becoming familiar with that, helped her kind of, I guess, buy into how that particular set of methods was helping her son. I think for her, delineating the communication and sensory issues relative to aggression and intelligence was probably the highlight of that. And to see how she viewed collaboration as being critical to identifying and supporting her son's needs, of course, through intervention. And I thought also for that particular segment, the use of technology was important, particularly how it was used to visually communicate choices for Tyler. That one I think was perhaps the most touching, because you could see, I don't want to say her pain, but her maternal, I guess, attachment, her concerns about her child, and wanting the best for him, particularly for his future. So that one I thought was excellent. And the second set of videos, Dylan was a 13-year-old that I'm like, how is it that this kid is diagnosed with autism? Because I did not see any of those hallmark traits that we commonly associate with autism. Man, I mean, it just blew me away how bright this kid was. Yeah, I mean, and I'll leave it at that. And I think the other part in that same segment, dealing with his sister Mia, who's 11, the thing that I thought was interesting in there is the intensity of the parent interventions, particularly in how the mother was working with Mia to develop socially appropriate communication skills. And then a third, Michael, who is age 17, that to me, that particular segment, I think was more, how can I put this? That's typically what you would see, those kinds of behaviors with a child who has autism. But I think overall, with those 3 different segments, I was struck by the variation in the features of autism. So that I enjoyed that part. But on the topic of evidence-based practices, I've divided those 27 into two categories. The first category being theoretical familiarity, and the second being practical familiarity. Starting with the former, the last one, practical familiarity. I looked across that list, and I only have familiarity with one of those in practice, and it was the functional behavioral assessment. And of that same group of 27, 19 are those with which I have theoretical familiarity, and that's come through um, the set of modules for Brandman, but also previous classes in the teacher preparation program. And then the other 7, um, I have no familiarity with, and I think because of that, those 7, which I'll list, are the ones that I'd like to know more about. The first being differential reinforcement, um, and I think I think knowledge is power, so I'd like to know more about the applications of that. Exercise is one. uh, I've not heard of that. So I think I just would like to increase my knowledge base in that particular one. The third one is scripting. I think that I can't really give a specific reason as to why. I mean, it just seems interesting to me in terms of using verbal or written um, descriptions to talk about a specific skill and modeling. The other one is response, interruption, and direction. That I think, particularly because of its application to interfering behaviors, that probably is why that has interest, because that's one that I've read about in recent weeks. Social narratives. I think that one for me is, I guess, of interest because of how that might be used at the secondary level. And then the last two, one is time delay. I've never heard of that. So I'd like to know more about it again because I want to increase how much I know so that I can be as helpful as possible. And then the last one is task analysis. I think I've probably had some um, knowledge of that, but not, I mean, it's vague in my mind, but I think that's probably helpful for my secondary students to break um, tasks up into manageable pieces. Um, but I think overall, the Iris module is probably the highlight, at least for this activity, simply because of I mean, when I see things like that, it's just proving the research true. Granted, very limited videos in terms of how much you see. I'm sure that some of that is edited or scripted. But again, just the variation that's seen is something that keeps cropping up as I go through these modules. But all of it very interesting, and I look forward to learning more.